All right, Bobby Lyte, thanks for joining us, buddy. We just had a quick chat just to get to know each other a little bit, and it's kind of weird actually talking talking to you. I've been listening to your voice for about
Right,
6 months, so to actually have a face to the voice is really cool. So
right.
yeah, where I'd like to start, really, if that's okay, is firstly, where did your passion for music, come from?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, first of all, Matt, thanks for having me on the show, and it's great to be here, and it's the first kind of interview I've done for the show, so it's exciting for me as
Amazing.
well. Yeah, and yeah, with regards to music, I kind of was, I think, a bit of a late bloomer with music. Growing up, I actually loved to dance. So I was always like, you know, actually in India. So my background is India. My cousins are in India. Most of my family's in India, actually. So when I'd go back to visit them, there's music is really big there as well. So I would just love to dance, but I never did anything with regards to like learning piano or guitar or any of that on my own until after college. And then I really got into kind of learning guitar and even getting into a rock band as well. But actually, now that you asked me, I do remember back in the day, I would make a lot of mixtapes. So I just listened to the radio and, pop in a blank cassette and just record songs that I liked from the radio. So making mixtapes is actually something I've done, you know, all my life.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, so there was that, and then it was once I moved to San Francisco, actually about 9 years ago now. That's when I really got into DJing, and the whole concept of just creating a vibration for a specific mood was something I started exploring a lot more, especially as a DJ. Um, so, a lot of different ways in which music has been in my life, but nothing kind of formally. I never took any formal education. It's just always been something I'm passionate about, something that really has helped me get into a good mind state. And so,
Okay, so let's get
yeah,
into that. So obviously, like you mentioned mind state. So in case listeners of this podcast haven't heard you before, I have been talking to a lot of people about your podcast already. So hopefully they
cool.
have heard me talk about it. But
Yeah.
like I said, I've been using flow state for about six months probably since you started. How long has flow state been going now? Maybe it hasn't been that
Uh,
long.
6 months is a pretty
Yeah.
close to the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
So, flow state, for those people listening who have never heard of the term
yeah.
flow state, or maybe they've heard of it, but they kind of don't really know what it actually means.
Right.
What can you kind of explain it in simple terms for people?
Sure. Yeah. So, uh, put simply, Flow State is a podcast designed to help you focus. And the way it does that is it does two things. One, it creates 30-minute sections of music that are entirely instrumental, no vocals. And also, the music is at a tempo and varied in a way such that it kind of helps you get into a more relaxed and focused state. And so that's the music aspect. But then the podcast combines that with what's called a Pomodoro technique. And a Pomodoro technique is basically a technique in which you time your focus and your breaks. So there's the 30-minute sections of music for you to focus to, and then there's a 5-minute breaks, which during which I I come in and talk and share some interesting bits about productivity, focusing, flow state, the science behind flow state. And so there's a lot of psychology as well that I include in the podcast. And so as a whole, each episode is meant to help you get into flow for a total of 60 minutes with, a 5-minute break. And and yeah, that's really the goal of the podcast, is to help you focus and get into more flow.
Yeah, well, that was, I think that's why I got so into it, because I think I emailed you and said to you, like, it was just by chance I was
Yeah.
looking, I think it was around Christmas time or a little bit before. I was looking for a new kind of journal. Like I used to use the self journal quite a bit, but I
Right.
was finding I went through this period of time during maybe the second lockdown. I think maybe it might have been the stress of everything, and I was just really struggling to
Yeah.
focus. I was really struggling to kind of, and I just felt like I needed like a bit of a system. And then
Right.
I started listening to your podcast and your music, and then
Hmm.
by chance I just found this journal. I think it's called the oh god, my mind's gone blank.
You
What did
you
I?
had mentioned it to
This is
me
called the
too.
productivity journal. That's what it's called.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And it basically, the productivity journal has you have to fill in these circles, and each circle is defined by a pomodoro round.
Right. Right.
And so it like your music fitted in with that. It was like, oh my
I
god,
see.
this is amazing, and I've been so much more productive. So I have
Wow.
a very simple system. Every night I sit down, I spend like 10 minutes just writing out what my pomodoros are going to be for the next day. And
That's
then,
amazing.
I've been getting up early. I've been getting up like 5:30,
Wow.
and I've been getting straight into that first task. Stick your music on, and
Hmm.
bam. And it just works. And yeah, I think the reason it works is it's just the simplicity of it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
prior to that, what I was doing is I'd created a playlist on Spotify with just some of my favorite tunes,
Okay.
just like 5 or 6 tunes, and I just used to put them on repeat over and
I
over, and
see.
that used to be my anchor, you know.
Uh,
But your the music that you do seems to work on a higher level. Can you explain why your type of music
yeah.
is kind of it gets people into that flow state better than maybe
Exactly.
like worded music?
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. So, you speaking of your Spotify playlist, that's actually exactly what I was doing for myself right before I created the show. Was I actually had a playlist. It was like called synthwave or coding, and it had specific songs that I noticed that when I listened to them, it would immediately calm me down and just get me into like a deep state of focus. And I was like, this just seems to work. So I kept kind of re-listening to that. And then, Spotify released this ability to, release music with talk, and that was like it just kind of like a light bulb moment for me where I was like, I could create this for myself. Maybe other people would like it too. And as I was starting to create these, I started to like, I'm still in the process of learning, like, why does this music work better than, certain other types of music? At a basic level, lyrics, not having lyrics, that's the first step, which is, when you hear lyrics, it draws you into a different context. You hear someone singing about something, it takes you out of the context you're trying to focus in. So that's the first thing that needs to be removed. The next thing, though, and this is what I really enjoy about making the playlist, is that there's, you could have instrumental music that's also not helpful for focusing. And so there's a lot of stuff with tempo. There's a lot of stuff with melody that kind of affects your your energy and your ability to kind of stay in the context you're in. So one example I use is sometimes I really love using songs that have melody to kind of give you energy. The melody sometimes creates this kind of inspiration where it's like, oh wow, I feel like I'm
Yeah.
building something amazing right now, and it gives you that kind of boost of energy and that inspiration. But if you keep that going for too long, what happens is you're now in this like high energy state. And so what I like to do is combine that with like another song that all of a sudden doesn't have any melody, but it has like this quicker tempo and more percussion, and that kind of gets you into the zone, right? So like I boosted you up with some energy, and then now I give you this like steady tempo song that
Yeah.
just kind of keeps you in that state, but keeps you focused on what you're doing. So these are things that for some reason, like, I talk to people about this and they're like, I guess I'm learning that I have an intuition about this.
Mm.
And it's just, I love doing it, but it's also great to see that it's actually working and it's actually helping people get into that deep flow. and
Well,
focus.
flow. I mean, you just mentioned that the word actually that kind of I was thinking about, which was you just mentioned the term the zone,
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
still remember. And it's funny the things you remember when you were young. But I must have been like
right.
11 or 12 or 13 years, maybe like, yeah, I'm really young. And it
Yeah.
was the first thing I'd ever heard. And it was a TV program, and they'd done this documentary on some Olympic athletes,
Mm.
and it was all about the zone,
Right, right.
this amazing like secret zone that these particular athletes were talking about and getting into,
Uh-huh.
and that they didn't really know much about how it was happening. It was almost like a magic trick type thing.
Yeah,
And now, like, there's a lot more science
there
around
is.
flow, and the
Mm.
actual, you know, it's something that we can actually intentionally create in our
Yeah,
mind. And obviously, music's one avenue. There's different ways of creating flow, and there's different
exactly.
methodologies to creating flow. Have you delved much into the science yourself, Bobby?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So actually, I'm actually currently taking a course on this
Nice.
because I love this stuff. I think flow for me so far in my life has been, like you said, like sort of it happens from time to time and it feels great, but it's like how do I actually create it intentionally and more often? And that's why I'm trying to learn the science behind this. One example I'll give you is our it's called flow triggers, and so everyone has different flow triggers. So one key point is that what works for you may not work for me. And an example that I know of in my life that it's like works for other people that doesn't work for me is coffee. So, at a young age when I started working, I noticed like everyone was drinking coffee at work, and I was like, let me give that a try. I drank coffee. Within 30 minutes, I felt like I was going to fall asleep. And I also just felt like this like jittery energy that I didn't
Mm,
like, that
yeah.
didn't help me actually be more productive. So one thing I've learned about myself is that I'm already kind of in a high energy state. And what helps for me is to like calm me down.
Mm,
And that's why some of the music stuff really works for me, because it calms me down, and then I can really get into focus. So some of the science behind flow state is really improving now, and we're really understanding this. And and I actually talked about this, I think, in the first or second, actually the first episode of flow state, which is flow state. There's like a 4-step process. And you know in order to, there's like the struggle phase. So it's not just an on or off thing.
yeah.
um, you'll notice struggle more obviously when you're trying to learn a new skill. So let's say you're learning something new. You'll struggle a bit, and it feels kind of like, you know it's not pleasurable, but that stage is necessary before you get into flow. um, and so I'm actually trying to remember the 4 stages, but the point is, one of the most important things that we're learning now is that everyone has different triggers. And I'm actually planning to share more of this, because one of my passions right now is like, I mean, getting into flow myself, but also teaching other people how to get into flow. And flow triggers is one of like the most important precursors, is understanding your own biology and figuring out what flow triggers work for you. It could be, even things like this, the way where you're sitting, your office, the way it's set up, like all those things matter. um, so it's great to see that there's a science, and
Yeah, and I
you can
think for
be
people
intentional.
listening, maybe that kind of are trying to grasp what flow is, or the side effects maybe of flow. Like,
Yeah,
we're talking about things like when time just disappears and you're
exactly.
so in the moment. Like, I'm sure people listening to this, they can think about a time when they look at the time and like, wow, the time's just gone. Maybe it's
Yeah,
catching up with a best friend, and they've just been so engrossed in conversation that
yeah,
2 hours has gone past and it feels like five
exactly.
minutes. Like,
Hmm.
that can be, so it's not because the misconception I had about flow, I started reading about flow. Was it Becoming Superhuman or something like that? Stephen Kotler, was that the
Uh, the one I read was Rise of Superman by
Rise of Superman? I
Stephen
read
Kotler.
that when it first came out.
Nice.
I listened to him on Tim Ferriss. I bought the book,
Cool.
and well, the only thing the one mistake I made was kind of feeling like, oh, this is for like the peak performers.
Mm,
This is like, because they gave the examples of the top surfers. That was one of the big examples with how are these surfers hitting these waves
yeah.
now where that were meant to be impossible. And
Right.
one of the reasons was the flow state that they were getting into.
Yeah.
But since more science has come out, it's like, no, you can get into flow state in such different areas of your life. And
Exactly.
one of the other side effects is just pure enjoyment and joy, right?
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah. So one of the things you talked about is like the timelessness, and it's the reason that actually happens is like when you actually enter flow, what's happening in your brain is that the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of your brain, kind of quiets. It gets quieter and it almost turns off. And that's actually where a lot of things are calculated, one being time. And so, because your brain is no longer calculating time, it's no longer thinking about the past or the future. And so, it gets you into this state of just pure, presence. You're just so present with what you're doing. And obviously, that is conducive to being extremely effective at whatever you're focusing on. It's like you have this like laser focus. Um, so that's one side effect, but also in that area of the brain, a lot of yourself is constructed. So your ability to think about yourself is also kind of removed. You're no longer like, thinking about, actually in that book he talks about, it's like your inner critic disappears,
Mm,
and because you no longer have a concept of self.
yeah.
And so that's another thing that's like really helpful to being laser focused on what you're doing. And then the last point you talk about is like this joy. So when you have your inner critic is quiet, when you're not worrying about the past or having anxiety about the future, what's left is like this incredible focus, but also this incredible joy. And you go from a state, what I've noticed is you go from a state from feeling like I want to be productive to get to this point. Instead, I get to a point where it's like, this is just enjoyable, and this moment right now, what I'm doing right now, justifies the experience itself. The outcome is no longer important to me. But then when you get to the outcome, it's actually much better because you've been so laser focused. It's like true
Yeah, if
inspiration.
you know what, it kind of just made me think the best way I could describe flow. I don't know if you would agree with this or not,
Yeah.
but for anyone that's never like understood that or heard about flow before, I think the
Yeah.
best way I could describe it is, you know when you sometimes have a dream
Right.
and you know in the dream that you're having a dream,
Right.
but you
Right.
haven't quite woken up, and you're sort of
Mm.
observing the dream, but you're kind of
Yeah.
thinking, I kind of feel it's a little bit like that. I mean, I don't know if you've got a sort of a really powerful experience of when you've been in a really deep state of flow. That there's
Yeah.
one time in my life that I feel
Uh-huh.
like because I knew about flow, I knew
Mm.
I was in it, but I was still enjoying it. And that was
Yes.
I used to play quite a high level of my sport, which is basically on the green bays in the UK, snooker and
Oh,
billiards,
cool.
and I was making a big break,
Uh-huh.
and it was just I felt like I was watching myself make the break from above the
Yeah.
table, and
Oh, that's great.
I wasn't even having to think about what I was doing. It was just going. It was going, and I there's not many times in my life I can remember that, but
Yeah.
yeah, you saying that what the way that you just described it, in that
Yeah.
you're kind of like you're away from yourself. You're observing yourself.
Mm-hmm.
That really struck a chord.
Exactly. Actually, I love the way you described it's essentially called lucid dreams, when
Yeah.
you're dreaming, but you're aware that you're dreaming. I think, I don't quote me on this, but it actually makes sense because the flow state, when you're in flow state, you're in a certain brainwave. I think it's between beta and theta, but again, don't quote me on this. I'm still getting to know the science. But when you're in a dream state, it's like a similar brainwave, I believe. So I can see how the experience is the same, and even as you describe it, it feels similar. I think the experience that I've had that comes closest to what you described is, I think it was 2019, 2 years ago. I was at, so I DJ as well, and I go to Burning Man, if you're familiar with
Oh
that.
wow, yeah.
And there was one day where it was like the entire day I just felt like I was in flow, and at one part I was DJing, and I could feel like a total, I was out of myself, but I felt connected with everyone at the party,
Mm,
and I felt like in total control. That's another kind of side effect of being in flow, is you feel like in complete control.
mm.
And it was just pure joy, you know. The experience is pure joy, but you're just not worried about any of your actions. And I mean, as a DJ, that's like the greatest state to be. And it really does rub off on people. Like, people sense you're in flow. You know, that's another
Yeah.
thing about it. So yeah, that way of describing it is a great way, a great analogy.
Yeah, I gotta say that the thing, to your credit, that really got me, and I don't know if you've had this before, but
Yeah.
your voice.
Yeah,
You,
people have told me that.
I just think it, literally within the first 10 seconds, I was in. I'm like, yeah,
Mm,
I'm in. Like,
yeah.
I mean, on a sort of a selfish point of view, how do you get your sound to sound so amazing?
Yeah. Well, so I think, so the first episode, you'll notice it's different from the first two episodes. I think I just use my AirPods microphone, and and it worked out fine enough. But then I was like, I should upgrade. Like, this is seems to be working. So I got a microphone. I can send you a link. I mean, that definitely helped. And then as a producer, I'm familiar with Ableton, so I kind of know what what kind of patches to set up to improve the
Right,
audio. So that definitely helped. But I guess the so that that's the technical side of things. And you know, I'd love to, I actually have a template for this on, like, I just record into that same project, the template's already set up. So that's on the technical side of things. I think otherwise, I have, you know, friends have told me like your voice is just soothing and calming. um I
I just
also, I
think it
think in,
fits the flow, the whole topic of flow. And like,
right,
I recommend anyone listening to this, like, go to Spotify, because just in case people don't know,
yeah,
obviously, because of the type
yeah.
of music you're doing, that has to be specific to Spotify. But go to Spotify,
Hmm.
and like, you'll understand what I mean when you listen to Bobby's voice, when it just catches you straight away. It's amazing.
Thanks, man. Yeah, no, I think the other thing I do is I intentionally, when I'm recording for the podcast, like, my intention is to, you know, like, help you kind of get into your flow state, and you know, share some interesting pieces of information. But I also don't want to pull you out of your own flow state. And so when I do record, I almost intentionally get into like a monotonous kind of mood, and I intentionally don't want to add too much emotion to what I'm saying, because I want your flow state to be your flow state. And that's actually why you'll notice lately I've also released like a second version of each episode, like the binaural version,
Yeah,
where I
really enjoying that.
replace,
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, part of the reason I released that was for my own sake, because you know, I was like, I don't want to keep listening to my own voice over and over. But I released a binaural version because also I noticed that during the 5 minute breaks, I think it's helpful to just sit in silence and reflect on what you've worked on, and then reflect on what you're going to work on next. But yeah, all of those things is, you know, I want to share information. I also want to help you kind of get into a relaxed state with my voice, but I also don't want to add too much. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, it just works so well. And so I want to get into, like, some strategy. So when
Hmm.
you're following this Pomodoro, I have got a question actually. So
Yeah.
Pomodoro, I know that it's semantics, but
Right.
is it 25/5 or is it 35? Because I keep seeing different things. Like, is it
Yeah.
25 minutes on and 5 minutes off, or what?
Yeah, so when I've looked into it, I think originally, like the very original inventor of this technique, I think it was 25/5, where he had Pomodoro, I think it means like tomato or something, and he had a timer that looked like a tomato, and he set it for 25 minutes, and then he would take 5-minute breaks. I think what I've learned also though is that people would start with that and then gradually move up to 30, 35, and then 45 minutes. But then, when you get to 45 minutes, it's possible that you want to take like a 10-minute break instead of a 5-minute break. So I've also gotten feedback with the podcast, people asking like, can you make 45-minute sections? And so I've thought of that. I think right now I want to keep it simple. And I think for the general audience, 30 minutes on and 5-minute breaks makes sense. But I'm excited to expand and see how I can kind of grow it.
Well,
And
yeah, I mean, personally, sometimes I am in a flow state when that 25 minutes is up, and I either just allow you just to keep talking, I just work through that,
right,
or I'll hit pause, or
yeah,
or you can just fast forward it a little bit, right? So
right, yeah, exactly,
it's no big
yeah,
deal, I don't think.
right.
So how do you use that the same strategy? Do you have a specific, like, because obviously my reason for doing this podcast is to help people be more productive. So many people are working
Right,
from home at the moment. A lot of our members as well, I know, are struggling a little bit with focus,
right.
and it's very easy working from home. There's so many distractions. I
Yeah,
think that's why I
exactly.
really wanted to talk to you, because I just feel like this is just such a good strategy for people to help them structure their day better, and just feel
Exactly.
like it's such a nice feeling when you can do that Pomodoro, that 25 minutes, and you can like tick it
Hmm.
off, or use the productivity journal and circle it off.
Exactly.
It just gives you that kind of momentum,
Yeah,
rather than,
yeah,
I think so many people, they just have a to-do list, and like,
yeah,
know, we know that to-do lists, that they're just not, they just don't work very well.
yeah. And like the to-do list, you just kind of, what I noticed in previously, and I still sometimes fall into this where it's like, oh, I got to get this done, and I just like sit down and try to get it done, and I don't really like prep myself for being in flow or in a deep state of focus. So, I kind of share how I use it myself, which is, let's say I'll start with the morning. So, I get up, I do my things, I have breakfast. And one of the things you'll notice with the podcast is like the beginning, I have this sort of mantra of like, before we get started, let's make sure you're in you know, a relaxed, comfortable place, ready to get to flow. And that's important. So like when I sit down, I try to remove any sort of distractions and really almost tell myself like, now I'm going to focus on one thing. And that's also, what I say in the podcast. And so let's say I do have a task list. I'll think of, okay, this is the most important thing. I'm going to focus on that. And I just sort of sit there and like let myself get ready to do that thing, rather than just jumping right in. And that's sort of the point of the intro of the podcast. And then as the music starts, it's like a cue or a trigger for me to telling me that I now am focusing on that singular task, and that's it. And I'll start working on it, and as I'm working on it, maybe thoughts come up, or something comes up where it's like slightly distracting. But the music being there reminds me that, oh, I've got 20 minutes till my next break.
Yeah.
I can deal with it then. And if
It's
it's
like
really
having
something,
a audio version of one of those timers, those egg timers,
exactly,
isn't it? And
exactly,
I did a podcast yesterday with a mindset coach, and he
uh,
was talking a lot about anchoring, and
yeah,
that's kind of, what it does is it kind of anchors the mind. It's a bit like
exactly.
people have associations with things, and that can be
Hmm.
a good thing or a bad thing. But if
Right.
you can start to have a music association with getting stuff done and
Yeah.
not being distracted, because that's why I think what you're doing is amazing. And I think, why I think we're going to see. I think you're going to be really successful with this. I don't know what your goals are for the podcast, but
Mm-hmm.
the fact that you're learning more about flow, that I
Mm-hmm.
think we live in such there's so much information in the world, so much noise, and I
Exactly.
think that there's so much information that we can do good with, but
Right.
obviously if we get too distracted, we we never get into one of the podcasts. You talk about deep work, which is
Exactly.
Cal Newport, right?
Yeah, Cal
And
Newport.
that's another book that I read a number of years ago, and
Cool.
I'm very much interested in this stuff as well because I'm very aware of how easy. I mean, I'm terrible. Just like even though I'm into this stuff,
Yeah.
these. I mean, if anyone's listening hasn't watched
Yeah.
the Netflix
The social dilemma.
The Social Dilemma, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, these algorithms, they are made to distract you. And
Mm.
for me, YouTube's the worst. I mean,
Yeah.
YouTube always gets me. I'll go to load up this podcast to YouTube, and
Yeah.
it would just show up a video that's exactly the timing that I was like, oh wow, that's I've got to
Yeah.
click on that video. It's so addictive.
Exactly. Their algorithms are very impressive.
So we're kind
Yeah,
of with productivity, we're swimming against the tide, I feel, and
absolutely.
we need to have strategies, just like other strategies, to kind of stay in our lane.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I love that you bring up deep work. Deep work, it's there's a lot of connection with flow state. I mean, it's sort of the same thing. And the point I love about deep work is he talks about how in this world, deep work is actually one, if not the most important skill set you can develop, because we live in such a distracted world with constant just noise all around us. And those people who cultivate the skill of deep work are the ones that will become most successful and most rewarded in our society. And so deep work is so important, and a precursor to any sort of deep work is getting into flow. Part of what they talk about in deep work is when you focus on something for an extended period of time, you uh, you essentially, your effectiveness on that subject is tenfold. And that's the same laser focus I talk about with flow. And so, like you said, there's this anchor with music. I used to try to follow Pomodoro myself, but I would have a timer, and just managing that timer every 30 minutes was just kind of a pain. Whereas now with this podcast, I don't need to take care of that either. And it's also more enjoyable because you have this music. Um, and so, the other thing I wanted to add is, so you've got the 30 minutes, you stay in focus. The one way I like to use the 5 minutes is, whether or not I'm using the silent version, the binaural version of the podcast or not, I like to just get up and do some sort of stretching. I'm a software engineer and I'm sitting at my desk all the time. It
Mm,
actually causes a lot of body pain. So what I'll do is I'll do some sort of stretching, but while I'm stretching, I'm sort of thinking about the problem I'm trying to solve.
yeah, yeah.
And so that's super helpful. And it's actually, when I come back to focusing, it's like I've progressed, so far, because I've now stepped away from the computer, thought about it in my head, um, and come back, and I've actually like almost solved the problem. So yeah, and
I'm a big fan of that. I mean, I sort of I'm down to about only about 10-20% of my day do I sit down and work now. So I work
that's
standing
great.
up most of the time. Been doing it for
Yeah.
about 6-7 years. But
Wow.
I got
Nice.
into the habit a couple of years ago of being seated more again. And
Right.
it had some real catastrophic effects on my back.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it reminded me of just how important the stand-up work is. So, but what I do
Exactly.
on the 5 minutes, because I'm working at my gym most of the time, or even
Oh,
at home
cool.
in my office, I have dipping bars and rings and rows, and I just do a
Nice.
few exercises. And some days I don't do a normal 30 to 60 minute workout. Instead, I just
Hmm.
do 5 minute workouts on the
Oh, that's
rest.
great.
And
Yeah,
then,
yeah,
so if you're working for 3 or 4 hours, I'm getting a good 25-30 minutes of workout in
yeah.
total volume by the end of the day,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and it keeps me energized. It keeps me productive,
Yeah.
And it's just a very different way of working. And
Yeah.
when people tell me that they can't leave their desk for 8 hours and that they've got so much to do, I'm so skeptical that they're
Yeah.
getting as much done as they really think they can. What's
Exactly.
possible,
Hmm.
because I mean, you're a coder, right? So
Yeah.
what has been the difference for you? I mean,
Yeah.
I wouldn't I I wouldn't have a clue. Like,
Right.
what's being like more focused and using these techniques? How much more productive do you feel you are now than say like 2 or 3 years ago?
Oh man, it's a huge difference. And to your point about, people who say like, oh, it's so much work, I need to be at my desk for 8 hours. What I've noticed actually is the days when I'm actually good about getting up and stepping away from the computer are the days in which I produce a lot more code and a lot more good code. And the reason being is your computer is actually not an if um, an effective tool at keeping you focused. Like your computer, even if I'm just looking at my code window, there's text and there's all this information about what I just wrote. And oftentimes I need to not look at that and think about what I'm coding next. So when I'm sitting there looking at my code window and I see, the class or the function I've just written, it's actually distracting me from what I'm trying to think about. And so not this podcast, but in general, the idea of like taking 5 minute breaks, but also, I sometimes get into a bad habit of like, oh, I've got a 5 minute break. I'm going to go look at YouTube or, do something else. That completely, one, takes me out of context, but two, it keeps me sitting in my seat, which is, going to aggravate my back. And then later on in the day, I'm not going to be as effective because I'm like in pain. So this idea of just getting up, stepping away helps my mind stay in focus, helps me solve the problem quicker, but it also refreshes my body. It puts my body in a new position. And so my back pain doesn't get re-aggravated. So I think the sitting at the computer, I'm actually doing less of it. I'll step away, I'll think about the problem, I'll come down, I'll code it up, and then it's like I'll step away again. So it's like I'm barely actually sitting in front of my computer, but I'm more effective and my body's not in pain because I'm not sitting all day.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
like such a new way of working. And I think especially now with the pandemic and everyone sitting at home, it can really, really change the relationship to your work and make it a lot more enjoyable.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Like, I think we obviously live in a very different world than say even 10, 20, 30 years ago. Um, the difference, the ratio of labor work to what Peter Drucker, the executive coach, calls like the knowledge worker. Like the knowledge
Yeah.
worker is really the new way of working. People need to
Exactly.
have to think a little bit more creatively, maybe,
Hmm.
than the vast majority of people once did. And
Yeah.
so, like you say, just looking at a computer,
Right.
or let's say your work isn't a computer, but just looking forwards and thinking that that's how going to help you solve the problem is
Right.
often that, which is why often people get their best ideas when they're running, when they're walking,
Walking.
maybe in
Yeah.
the shower. Like,
Hmm.
I literally every time I have a shower, I just have an idea. It's like,
Yeah.
wow. And I always think
Yeah.
I need to like just like schedule this into my week because
I know, right?
sometimes it's like, well,
More
that might
showers.
have taken me 2 hours to work that out, but I just had a shower and
Exactly.
now I'm like, oh, or particularly like a cold shower where it like really invigorates you.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
these
These
state
things.
changes are things that many people just aren't aware of, right?
Yeah. Yeah. They're super important. And the examples you gave, which is walking, running, or showering, the common denominator with all of those things is you're not looking at some external stimuli. There's no, you're not, hopefully while you're walking or running, you're not looking at your phone or when you're showering. And so there's no external stimuli. And so all that's left is your internal intuition. And, and so that's actually where you solve your biggest problems and your greatest inspiration comes from. And so that's um, but that's an area which we get less often these days because we're constantly flooded with social media and news. And so how can you create more moments like being in the shower or walking? And that's the other kind of thing that I think is working with this podcast is the music kind of is there to get you into a certain vibration, but it kind of is still quiet enough that your internal inspiration and intuition can come about.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, well, it's been really great talking. So, are there any areas like obviously the first place people should start in learning and implementing flow into their life is going to your podcast, and then
Yeah.
after that, are there any books or courses or any areas that people can learn more about flow if they're really interested in this topic?
Yeah, so that's what I mean. I love about the podcast is I'm also sharing a lot of knowledge about flow state, and so yeah, go to the podcast like you mentioned. The podcast is on Spotify. It's called Flow State, and I think just listening to the podcast to help you get into flow, to help you be more productive, is the first place. But then during the 5 minute breaks, I talk a lot about different books where I've learned about flow or deep work or being more productive. And all the episodes have links to those books. So I think those are all great places to start to learn about flow. And the other thing I would add is, you get into this, the motivation for getting into flow initially is just to be more productive. We're all trying to strive to be our best, to improve our game, to make more money. That's the initial start. The one thing I've noticed over time is that flow state itself, the experience itself justifies itself. And so you start to look less at the outcome of like, oh, I want to be more productive. And you start to just be like, I just want to be in flow more often in my life. I think that is indicative of a joyful, fulfilling life is more flow. And
Yeah.
then and I think one of my inspirations for the podcast and flow in general, this is why I'm taking a course as well, is at a bigger scale, flow, more people being in flow means more people in peace, means actually, one of the things that scientifically has been proven is people who experience more flow increase their ability to empathize. And so I think at a larger scale, more people in flow means a more peaceful world, a more effective world, a more empathetic world. So I think at a large scale, it's extremely exciting to me that people would be motivated by flow internally just by productivity. But I think it can lead us to an even more beautiful place.
There's a lot of depth to it, isn't there? When you
Yeah,
start talking about it, you made me. I mean, one of the things that you've made me realize in this conversation is you reminded me of actually like the productivity thing is less important to me now than
yeah,
the sort of the contentment or and the
exactly.
relaxation that you get from just being in that state. Because
Hmm.
I definitely feel like I'm finishing my days just feeling a little bit less kind of. I think when people are
Yeah,
following to-do lists and like they're just trying to check off, I think there's a difference between that and just being in flow state
yeah,
and getting stuff done, but finishing the day feeling quite content with your work and
and energized.
and energized. And the other thing is as
Yeah,
well is like like you said, you there's a sense of like purpose
yeah,
and passion in your work when you're in flow state. So
absolutely.
that's only going to be good for your mental health.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. When I'm find myself just following a task list or trying to get something done and just, not really being in flow, I end the day feeling exhausted. And, I just kind of want to go to sleep and let the next day start. Where if I've experienced a lot of flow during the day, when I'm done, I feel like I'm ready to do more, or like I'm ready to now go to the gym, or I'm ready to go cook dinner. And you just feel that kind of energy. And, that type of state also creates a lot more peace in your life, whether it's with your partner or with your friends. You're just in a higher state of being. So it's just you know, the Trojan horse is, I guess, being more productive. But once you get there, you start to notice that this just, you know, impacts your life in so many other ways. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's great. I definitely want to learn more as well. So am I right? I think Stephen Kotler's got a new book out.
Yeah. The Art of the Impossible,
Yeah, I
which
think
I
that's
haven't gotten
maybe.
yet.
I haven't. No, apparently it's a lot more practical than the
Right.
first one. So that
Yeah.
may be worth checking out as well.
That
But
makes sense. He's well, real quickly, yeah, I'm actually, the course on flow state I'm taking is his course.
oh, great.
It's called Zero to Dangerous. If you guys want to check it out online, but it's he's, I think, you know, his first few books, he did a lot of research and learned a lot, but then he's applied it a lot in teaching other people now. And I think The Art of the Impossible really shares a lot of those principles and those learnings. Um, but yeah, it's an incredibly kind of deep world that seems endless, and it's really cool also because it feels like kind of a merging of spirituality and science.
Mm.
Um, yeah, you know, like I actually I meditate a lot, and that was kind of another way in which I got into flow. But then now I'm really learning the science, and I see those two worlds kind of colliding in flow. So it's just really exciting.
Yeah, it kind of makes you think there's still so much we don't know about how
Yeah,
the brain works. It's crazy.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Well,
It's exciting.
Bobby, thanks so much for coming on and sharing. I hope our listeners enjoy your playlist and your podcast as much as I do. And I'd love to catch up maybe another time, maybe in a year or so. We can talk about your findings from the course that you're doing
Yeah,
and how life is going since you've been implementing those things. And you're
yeah.
obviously going to build up even more knowledge around flow, so we can get you back on and you can feel free to share more wisdom around how we can get into
Absolutely.
flow.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate being on here. I love talking about this stuff, and it seems like you're learning a lot about this stuff too. So we should keep in touch, and I'd love to be back on. Yeah,
Yeah.
anytime.
Okay. Well, take care, Bobby, and I wish you all the best for the podcast. And I know the download's going crazy. That's one of the
Yeah,
geniuses of it, is because people are putting it on repeat, and so
yeah.
that's just amazing. So, yeah, I'll we'll catch up soon, buddy. Take care.
Absolutely. Take care, Matt. Thank you so much.